Pádraic, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thanks for having me.
So, could you please kick us off by introducing yourself? Just tell our listeners who you are, where you are, and what you do.
Very good. The latter one is kind of a tough question, but I should be able to answer the rest of them fairly straightforward. So we're based here in today in sunny Salt Hill. So the weather isn't always this pleasant here in the west of Ireland. So we're in Galway, which is the capital city, I guess, of the west of Ireland, and so Mickel Distillery is the first operating whiskey distillery in Galway in over 100 years. And so I'm Pádraic, of course, and I suppose the original modern founder, if you want to call it, of the distillery, which officially started in 2016. But we have a much longer family lineage in distilling than this generation. So my brother and I, we're the sixth generation of distillers in our family, but the tradition goes way back to our great grandfather's time. Mickel was his name, and that's a first name. So we have Ireland's longest unbroken family distilling tradition today. So it's well over 170 years old, and so that's us, I guess, in a nutshell.
Brilliant. Yes, I like the distinction of modern founders. I think that we'll get into some of the backstory as we go here. Initially, I reached out to you quite a while ago because I was interested in Poitín, and I think maybe we should start by looking into the pronunciation there because I've heard it
No problem.
pronounced Poitín. And I've also listened to interviews that you've done where you kind of emphasize the S, the Poitín. So, as somebody who produces this stuff, how should our American listeners be pronouncing this distillate?
I think your American listeners value authenticity, and it is an Irish word, as in from the Irish language. And first of all, the etymology is it comes from the Irish word for pot, which is putta, and then a small pot is putteen. So anything made in a small pot still. And I think if they want to go with the Irish language version, then putteen is the easy. Well, sorry, it's not probably the easy one. It's the more authentic one. There's nothing wrong, by the way, with the anglicized forms, which are Pachin or Puchin, but I think most people these days value the authentic version. So I let them make up their own minds as to which version to go with. You're an independent country yourselves, and ye also share that piece of history with us. The fact that you also had to gain your independence, albeit that ye have a longer span of independence than we do. So I'm guessing from that perspective that your listeners will like the unanglicized version.
Sure. And I think that there's an interesting thread that I'd like to maybe just jump right into here, connecting some of the American native, what we might call rebel distilling operations here in the United States with some of the distilling traditions in Ireland, specifically the ones that are responsible for poutine.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you might, since we're talking about independence from the British Empire, maybe just give us a little bit of background about the distillate that you produce. Obviously, you have a gin, you have some aged Irish whiskeys, but specifically when it comes to poutine, can you back us into that by maybe talking about why it was a bit of a rebellious thing to make in the first place, and maybe how that eventually ties in with some of the things that we here in the U.S. call moonshine?
Absolutely. So we've already touched, I suppose, on what poutine means, the spirit of the small pot still, or simply small pot still. Um, the original, I suppose, if you want to call it words or words that we used here in Ireland, come from the Latin aquavitae. So some monks, first of all, brought aquavitae to Ireland, and the manuscripts then show the translation of that, and that became Ishkebaha. And just for fear of ambiguity, that means water of life. And over time, then that was shortened into one word. It became fushke. Interestingly, that's the word that we use in the Irish language today to describe both poutine or modern day Irish whiskey. So we use poutine and fushke. interchangeably. And of course, fushka means the water of life, as does whiskey. And the first written date we have of this spirit is 1324. And no surprises, I'm sure your listeners are very familiar with this territory, but that does make us the inventors of whiskey. So our Scottish neighbours, of course, make wonderful whiskey, but there's approximately 60 years of a gap between us, just to make that one clear. But anyway, even to this day, in Irish-speaking regions, we use the term fushke, which does encapsulate both poitín and whiskey. And I guess just in a short one sentence, the thing that separated the two was the buying of a license. So we'll jump into that one now in a second, but we've started, I think, with the initial date. So what happened was, once the monks learned how to do it, documented it, etc., it then spread to the rest of the population. The craft of making spirit, the craft of fushka making, poitín making, whiskey making, whatever term you prefer to use at this point. And so we're talking about the same thing. They were all the same back then. And then you get to a point when we were under British control in 1661, and they decided to tax the making or the distilling of alcohol. And you can appreciate, I suppose, our perspective on it, that we didn't really feel like paying these taxes, to our, I suppose, oppressor, if you want to call it, oppressor government. So most people decided to evade the payment of tax. So obviously this frustrated, British Parliament a huge amount, and eventually the laws just became stricter and the fines became heftier. So then, we land at a point when in 1760, Parliament decided to ban the domestic distilling of alcohol. So up until then, you didn't have to have a license to make alcohol. You were just expected to pay your taxes. But because by and large, most of us rebelled against the payment of taxes because we felt that this was, a right that we would be able to make our own alcohol and not pay tax on it. But anyway, it became a licensed activity, in a formal way from that year on. And that's formally when poitín was banned, or the domestic distilling of alcohol. And that remained the case up until 1997, believe it or not. And one multinational company lobbied government at the time to permit the making of poitín, at least to be able to label a product called poitín. And that opened the doors, once that happened. So you can kind of trace the development then of what we call, I suppose, modern day Irish whiskey. From that period of 1661 onwards, we then have a tradition of more urban and industrial distilleries setting up. And of course, no surprises, this is all for control of taxation. So the tax collectors and the government wanted to make tax collecting as efficient and as easy as possible. So they said, no more domestic distilling, no more small distilleries, just big distilleries in urban locations. Let's keep this easy. And they still had struggles. They really struggled with the quality of whiskey during that period. And they made some silly rules that forced the distillers to make whiskey quickly. And I'm sure, as you and your listeners know, making whiskey quickly is a bad idea. It ended up, making rough whiskey. And then, of course, they had to reverse many of these decisions or find ways around them. So, for instance, rather than taxing the distilleries based on I suppose, what they produced, they decided to tax them on their potential output. So, what was the maximum output? They just basically taxed them on that. So, this meant that they were paying tax on stuff that they didn't even produce. So, what did they do? They tried to push more product through more quickly, and it led to a rough spirit. And poitín sales, funnily enough, went upwards rather than downwards. So they were having the opposite effect that they wanted. Now, of course, with the invention then of the spirit safe, that, I suppose, left the control once again in the hands of the tax collectors. The only people who had the keys to the spirit safe were actually the tax collectors, not the distillery owners or the head distillers or anything like it. And the other, I suppose, key thing is that this guy called SHAN-a-khee, which you're probably familiar with, or your listeners are familiar with, the guy who quit his tax collecting career to become an inventor of a new piece of technology called the coffee still. He revolutionized whiskey and spirits around the world. But he was the one who advised government to let the whiskey distillers pay tax on the spirit when it came out of cask, as opposed to when it went into it. So in 1823, or pre-1823, the law was you pay tax on whiskey when it comes off the still. Post 1823, because of SHAN-a-khee's advice to Parliament, they decided to allow the distillers to pay the tax on the whiskey when it came out of cask. And the big result there, and this is intentional, is that they would encourage the spirit to be aged. So we may think that whiskey has been aged forever, but we can trace the early sort of aged whiskey to that date. Now, that's not to say that we weren't aging any whiskey at all before then, but that's when it became advantageous from a tax perspective to do it.
My goodness, that is quite a mouthful. That's and all of it, it seems, kind of ties back to the notion of taxation. And when we keep in mind that we're talking about something that we refer to as the water of life, it seems in that respect somewhat essential. And so the question then becomes like, why am I, if I value this thing and view it as so essential that I call it the water of life, one might begin to understand why people's feathers were ruffled on having to suddenly pay taxes on it. So I appreciate the fact that you were able to kind of not only give us the history of Poitín, but also explain it relative to some of those big historical moments that some of our maybe whiskey fans in general might be familiar with, such as Anise-Coffee and the coffee still, kind of the beginning of continuous distillation there. So let's talk about your family and your operation. When did you... we know that this had to be after 1997 when we finally were able to create Poitín legally again. But when did you first get the idea that it may be time to formalize and create a company and start putting some money and some resources behind this project of creating your own spirits?
Yeah, so look, we were very fortunate, my brother and I in particular, that we grew up around this tradition. So our grandparents were literally next door, and it meant that we spent a lot of time with our grandfather, and I suppose he was a very influential figure. He was a natural storyteller. So in Ireland, he would be known as a SHAN-a-khee, a title that he would never use himself, by the way, but others would use it for him. And a seanchaí is a storyteller, and a person, I suppose, who preserves wisdom from previous generations. And this is the oral tradition, I suppose, of folklore. So, yeah, very rich tradition there. And, again, very well able to tell stories in an interesting, engaging kind of way. And back then, during his time in particular, storytelling was the way of passing on the wisdom from one generation to the next. And even in terms of situations in life, how do you deal with this particular situation? How do you react? And how should you behave in a certain situation? It was all interwoven in the stories. So modern day parenting is very much, this is how you do it, or that's how you do it. But this was a very subtle way of, imparting this piece of knowledge without being, I told you so. It was in the stories, so it was an indirect way of explaining how best to deal with certain situations, etc. But yeah, so very influential guy, and have very fond memories of spending time with him on the farm, and learning everything there is to do with Poitín, and turf cutting, and stone wall building, and looking after livestock, and breaking in horses, etc. It's all part of rural Connemara living, and it all comes as one package. You can't have an a la carte type scenario. But in any case, lucky, I suppose, from an early age to hear the stories of Poitín, and then sort of as you got older, you'd get more opportunity to see what went on, and finally the opportunity, I suppose, to look after the still. And he did put trust, I suppose, in his grandkids, I suppose, where that was appropriate. So he it wouldn't be kind of how would I put it, off you go, but you'd be very how would I put it, you'd be monitored until he thought you had everything down to a T. But you'd always get this feedback, yeah, just adjust that a bit, or do this, or try that, and eventually then you'd be mastering your craft. So that's how it went, and of course then you'd be given almost full free reign. And then eventually, I suppose, when we set up legitimately, then in 2016, he was the head of what we call quality control. He'd be getting a bottle of something every week, whether it was poitín or gin or whiskey. And so we'll go back to the gin story in a moment. But I know that there was a question about it earlier. But so that was, I suppose, a bit of the learning curve. It was just a part of growing up in Connemara, and really great stories. I might tell you one or two of them, but stories from the previous generations and close calls and stuff like that. But certainly there was one story that I haven't actually told very frequently, but there was an occasion, and it's early in the last century. So we're talking 1930s, we'll say 1940s. There was a still being run approximately 2 miles from the old family home, and they got word that the police or the peelers were on the way, and there wasn't really enough time to dismantle the still. So they basically just left the still and hoped that they wouldn't that the police wouldn't discover the still. And look, we're not particularly superstitious or whatnot, but or particularly religious or whatever. But there was a specific prayer, and don't ask me how to translate it. I will do my best to translate it, but it's different to a prayer. It's probably more. I don't know if it's called it's like a mantra almost, but it's called Ara Undolamu. Really, it translates as I suppose a mantra or prayer to disorientate the police or whoever your enemies were. So I can't remember which family member actually said the prayer. I believe it was my great grandfather's wife at the time who said it. And now this is according to onlookers. They saw the police just literally encircle the still. They went all around the area, but never actually came into the place where the still actually was, and they didn't discover it, despite it being kind of there in plain sight. So anyway, that was just one of the little stories there. So possibly a bit of luck, but there was that story anyway.
One of the things that I'm really picking up on is it's kind of maybe two things, I suppose, that go hand in hand. There's the oral tradition where the knowledge about distillation, and not just the knowledge about distillation, but the culture of tending the still, right? It's something that you're brought up with. When the first time you get to be around this thing, I'm sure that it seems almost magical, and these elders who are actually pulling the strings and making the cuts and doing all of these technical things that at first from a distance as a child seem like magic. Then as you get to grow, then you learn that some of these things aren't necessarily magic, but they're maybe perhaps more mechanical or chemical. They're kind of moves that you can make. It seems like a very different way of learning the art and science of distillation than perhaps most people come to it today. I know a lot of people who are distillers, at least here in my community here on the East Coast, tend to be engineers. Many of them have spent time in the military, either fixing or maintaining or operating heavy machinery. A lot of them have advanced technical degrees. Some of them are biochemists. Very few of them have the sort of background and deep history that you are bringing to it. So I think from our perspective, here on the East Coast, or the coasts of the U.S., where things are very mechanized and very tied to supply chain, and instead of being perhaps rebellious, tend to seek to kind of fall into these categories and fit neatly within the boxes. What I'm hearing about your family history is that it's very different from that. We're all producing spirits of some sort, but to me, a lot of the character of what you're describing comes from that dual impulse of this is our heritage, it is our water of life, and sort of, pardon my French, the police.
Yes, completely. And it's interesting, the conversation, I suppose, comes up every now and again, just in general conversation with people, and it's sort of like, how do you get passionate about things? And it's funny, if you grow up around something, it's kind of hard to say how do you get passionate about it, but there's something really rich about when you're able to think back, and I suppose you have these moments where you think back, wow, actually, it's amazing that that tradition has come all the way down through those different generations. You kind of feel connected to your ancestors as a result, and it's quite an emotional connection that you have with them, and the struggles that they had, in terms of, I mean, it wasn't easy for them in terms of making spirit because it was illicit, and it wasn't certainly easy, I suppose, as well. The fact that they, didn't have freedom for X amount of, generations. But now that said, as well, one of it probably just took the straw that broke the camel's back for me. It was in 2011, and I don't mean it in a negative sense, but it was the little spark that all that fuel, if you like, required to actually spur me on to actually, start a distillery. It certainly inspired the thinking about, doing a legitimate Poitín distillery. Um, so I was just reading about tequila, and what really fascinated me about it was the wonderful craftsmanship that was there, and the misconceptions that people previously had about the spirit. And I thought, there's so many misconceptions around Poitín and Fushke, and I thought we should really communicate to people and tell them through spirit and through story, um, what the real truth is, as opposed to people relying on unreliable information. So that was the kind of the spur on, and I thought, this is you almost need to sometimes see it from the outside to actually see it from the inside. So you're looking at it from the outside, and then you see, if you're in it, it's almost like you can't see the wood for the trees, but then you step outside of it, and it's like it made so much sense. So that started the crazy journey. And I remember actually having a conversation with my grandfather. Like I said, we were very close, and I wanted to actually go to the US, and I knew that I had been there before, but I knew that craft distilling was beginning a renaissance. And I said, "Wow, I must check this out as part of research." And before I, took any further steps, I said I just wanted to kind of get his blessing, I guess, to make sure that he would be happy, with me going legitimate, so to speak. So he was out in his little garden or field just beside the house, and he was digging potatoes. So I said to him, I've had this idea, and he goes, "Okay, go ahead." So I wasn't sure how he'd react, to be honest, but I explained to him that I was thinking of starting a legal distillery, and taking the family craft and working it that way. And he said, "Well, I'd be delighted," he said, "if you did it, and if there's any way I can help, I certainly will." So he stood by that, in fact, and it's really nice today. You can see it in the background there behind me, the logo. So that's an image. Well, the logo is based on an image of Jimmy, and he lived until he was 93 years old. So he only passed away there in 2020. So thankfully, he was able to see the distillery up and running and progressing very well. So yeah, delighted that he got to see that much of it.
Absolutely, yeah. It seems like those first few runs you were describing, where he was playing the role of quality control. I'm sure that even though you were probably using more sophisticated equipment than was being used during the bulk of your family's distilling tradition, he probably still had some wisdom to share. So I'm really glad that there was. It seems like a good bit of overlap between the sort of rebellious tradition, the torch being passed to you in a bit more of an official capacity. And I really like what you said about, kind of viewing things from the outside, seeing like, ooh, there's all these misconceptions about poitín. And, perhaps we can be the ones to, through flavor and through the experience of tasting, perhaps correct some of these misconceptions. So, what are some of those misconceptions? And maybe this might be a good way for us to explain what poitín is as a category, because one of the things that I wrote down in some of the questions that I sent you is like, what is the deal with poitín? Vodka is one of these things that can be made from almost anything as long as it is unaged and neutral. Then we have certain different types of whiskeys that need to be made out of certain distillate bases. Of course, here in the US, we have bourbon. There's a lot of very strict rules about what constitutes bourbon whiskey and some of the little modifier words that you can stick onto that. Where does poitín fall in this landscape? And again, maybe that will allow us to talk about some of these misconceptions that you've set out to correct.
100%. One of the great misconceptions, and this is probably more amongst Irish people, they think that poitín is a potato-based spirit, and just to be clear, were potatoes ever used in poitín? They were, but they would, generally speaking, have been an adjunct ingredient. So you can't get enzymes out of potatoes like you can out of grain to turn starches into sugar. So you would have to rely on the malt enzymes to turn those starches into sugars. So I'll start out by saying that. So yes. And by the way, it was a much later part in the history. Just to be clear as well, in our family, we never did use potatoes. It was always a grain-based spirit. Now, when you go back to the original aquavitae, and this is no secret, it's documented in historical documents, but the earliest form of aquavitae was actually wine that was being imported, that was then being distilled. But then there was a shift to cereal because we were already, brewing ales or beers or various fermented drinks from grain. And then, of course, the main tradition in terms of cereal, and it's really, these distillers were resourceful people. They used what they had available to them, as opposed to trying to stick rigidly to any particular sort of rules or regulations. These rules and regulations came in later, and I think the reason they came in, and I fully agree with them, is to protect the integrity of the category, so that we don't kind of lose sight of what poitín or whiskey is, respectively, and I think that's only fair. So the main ingredients in poitín, and it's kind of in this order, and you can use a mix of them, and it's basically what was available or what was sown in that particular year. And of course, these distillers were normally farmers as well, so they had to do crop rotation. So you wouldn't grow the same crop in the same field every year, but barley, oats, wheat, and rye would have been the primary cereals used in the making of poitín, and each of them delivering a different flavor profile, each of them performing differently in different soils. So, for instance, barley gave you the optimal sort of yield, optimal flavor, and then by comparison, then oats wouldn't give you as good a yield. So you'd typically use it as an adjunct ingredient, but it gave you creaminess and it gave you vibrancy. So wheat then, and sorry, going back to the oats, it was quite a resilient grain, so it would grow in acidic soils as well. And again, a lot of west of Ireland, while it is quite green, it still wouldn't be the most fertile of soils. Again, it has a relative fertility, but it did take a lot of minding, and it'd be a harsh enough environment. Lots of rain, lots of wind, etc., lots of salt if you're close to the ocean. And then the likes of wheat would be quite a severe crop on soil, so you'd need really good soils for that to grow. So for that reason, it was further down the list. Rye grew particularly well in the sort of west of Ireland soils as well. However, you wouldn't use it in huge proportions because it did have the tendency to burn out the pot stills if you use too much of it. So there was a valid reason, I suppose, for not using a huge amount of that, but worked very well in terms of how it grew in the soils. So they were the main cereals.
I can see, based on the way that you're describing this, with the crop rotation and going back to the notion that as a farmer, somebody living this lifestyle in the part of Ireland that you're describing, you don't get, as you said, an a la carte experience. If you're going to plant the crops, you need to rotate the crops. That means that this year's batch is not going to be exactly the same as last year's batch. On the other hand, over time and with the development of this tradition, you can also see how certain people with a particular talent for this craft would develop a reputation individually, and then also based on the strength of the wisdom that they're able to pass down over generations for being particularly talented poitín makers. So I really appreciate you taking the time to bring us through those grains, because I think even though it's just a description of how much and what types are being used, I can still begin to get a picture of how this developed over time. And, of course, the other thing about potatoes is that, if we're looking at some of the dates that you're mentioning here, 1324, if that's when distilling is beginning, there were not potatoes in Ireland
No,
at this
correct.
time. They were a New World crop and only brought over much later. So I'm beginning to get a sense of how this tradition evolved, much more so than I previously had. Now, I'm wondering, here in the U.S., a lot of terms and some certain spirits categories have something to do with the type of still used. Now, obviously, poitín, the name of it refers very specifically to the size of the still. It's a small pot still.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering if any of the still technology, or then perhaps the storage of the spirits after they come out of the still, does any of that play into some of the misconceptions that there might be about poitín?
I think so. And just one point, I suppose, that I haven't mentioned, and it ties into your question as well in terms of aging, etc. So, the method of moving your finished spirit back in the day was by cask. You would then, of course, bottle your poitín or your fushke, out of a cask. So you wouldn't necessarily bottle at the site of distilling. And just to be absolutely clear, I suppose, because the spirit would normally be sold fairly quickly after its making, it meant it didn't spend very long in cask. But there would be a certain small influence, perhaps, of the cask on the spirit, but nowhere near, I suppose, the influence of whiskey. And of course, we know, I suppose, in terms of whiskey, how that all happened. It was devised, I guess, to improve the quality of the whiskey, but also to improve the cash flow perspective from the big distilleries. Again, that later became law because they recognised, well, this actually creates a barrier to entry into the category, and it also protects the standards of the category by having some sort of standardization. But anyway, just on the poitín side of things, the current, I suppose, modern definition is that you can't age poitín any longer than 10 weeks in a wooden cask. So, and again, of course, Irish whiskey must be aged for a minimum of 3 years. So, just to kind of distinguish them nowadays, whereas both of them were clear spirits in the early days. Now, another little thing, I suppose, and this is kind of ties into the ingredients. We use this wild flower called Bogbean in our poitín, and actually that's referenced in the Red Book of Ossory in 1324. And again, so while yes, our family were using it, they didn't invent it. This is something that was handed down, through multiple generations, and the monks supposedly were using it as a medicinal element, but also as a flavor element. So there was many reported kind of benefits of the bog bean, and interestingly as well, from having people from different regions around Ireland in. Some of them, most of them, by the way, don't recognize bog bean, but the few that do would mention, oh, my grandmother or my grandfather used to literally make a medicine out of that botanical. but it wasn't included in Poitín per se. So it's funny how these various evolutions of the tradition have survived. So in terms of terminology and stuff, the condenser in a poitín still, that the part that turns the vapors from the pot into liquid, would be known as a worm here in Ireland, as opposed to a condenser. And then, funnily enough, the line arm was just simply called an arm in the Irish language, or arm. And then you'd have a cap. And a lot of these caps would have been wooden as opposed to copper. But really important that you'd have a copper line arm and a copper condenser, and your pot would also be made of copper. So they were aware, without the science or that kind of wisdom, they knew that the copper had a positive influence on the spirit. So it's incredible how intuitive they were about their craft. The way they sealed these stills as well was with the material called lutein. So that's what they would apply to the joints. And lutein is a mixture of flour, porridge, and water. And of course, I have to mention, of course, the tradition which then started in the US. And according to history anyway, it was Irish and Scottish distillers who migrated, who continued distilling, and also wanted to avoid the authorities as well, made it at night. And to the best of my knowledge, and according to some of the literature, it's where the term moonshine originates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do actually recall watching a television show where somebody was actually creating very similar substance to what you just described, the lutein, to seal some of these some of these engineered kind of cobbled together stills in the woods. So I do think that tradition has definitely carried forward through here to the United States. It's interesting to me. I noticed that you described earlier 10 weeks for Poitín, no more than 10 weeks in cask. I personally appreciate that's an attempt to stay true to the history of the spirit. And then we have 3 years minimum for Irish whiskey.
Correct.
What happens if one decides one would like to leave a distillate in a cask for somewhere between 10 weeks and 3 years?
Then it's neither Poitín and it's not whiskey either. So it would be considered, I guess, Irish spirit. So really, when you start out the production of any product here, in terms of the regulations, you need to give prior notification to your revenue control officer, which is basically the equivalent of your TTB officers, to let them know that you're making a certain product on a certain day. So once you write it into the sort of documents, to the best of my knowledge, you can't really change what it will become. Now, you'd have to get permission, I would say, to say, look, if your putting went over 10 weeks, that you would then have to get permission to call it Irish spirit. So yes, you followed all the rules in terms of, making it in your bonded warehouse, etc. However, it doesn't fit the legal definition of either now. So the only likely kind of term is probably Irish spirit or something else, but you couldn't call it either. I think it's valid though that the 10-week rule would apply, given the history of Poitín, and while some may argue, look, it would open up innovation, etc. Really, I think it's more important to stay true to tradition, which is that Poitín was an unaged spirit, because otherwise, what would differentiate it from whiskey, its earlier predecessor, or they were the very same thing. And of course, the reason they're different now is because of that evolution.
Well, if something like that ever does happen to you, where you maybe leave something in cask a little too long and realize after the fact, then you just give me a call, and maybe we can put together some sort of mantra to confuse the revenue officer, some sort of prayer like you were describing earlier. Maybe that'll work. So I want to take this notion of the Bogbean, which is fascinating. I love that it originates in that original 1324 text that you were describing earlier. It seems like a botanical of sorts, and so it goes in with the mash, or it goes into the still. it exerts a flavor into the finished product, which I'm guessing is one of the hallmarks of your product. Now you also create a gin, which involves more botanicals. What makes your gin sort of unique and reflective of the place where it is made?
Yeah, and great question. I suppose the first thing is we started out making poutine here. So if we were, how would I put it, thinking completely commercially when we began, we probably would have decided just to make gin at the beginning and maybe make poutine as an adjunct product. But we went straight in with poutine, and I have to tell you, people still primarily recognize us from that perspective. It's really, I think people recognize that we were true to our tradition, and so there's a certain amount of respect that came with that. So we're thankful for that. Again, wasn't really pre-planned. We just you know. Blissfully unaware, I guess, of these commercial realities, we just started making poutine because that's what we made. Um, Now, of course, obviously, the opportunity, of course, is that it's a very different and poorly understood spirit. So there's a lot of opportunity there. But in terms of gin, we were inspired, I guess, because our poutine already contained a botanical, and we know that previous poutines and aquavitae would have contained various botanicals. So we thought we should make a gin that encapsulates Connemara based on our botanical distilling tradition. So we tested a number of, we'll say, iterations. So we then selected 4 wild flowers and herbs that we now collect and harvest in Connemara. So we select them. Now, the one exception is the bogbean. We can pick that one all year round. The other three, we pick them when they're in season, which is generally speaking late summer, early autumn. So bog myrtle is one of those. Hawberry is another one, and heather flower is another one, and of course the bog bean. So bog bean is used fresh. The other three are collected and dried, and then used throughout the year for various gin distillations. But really, I'm going to quote quite a famous bartender here in Ireland. They have multiple awards in the Vintage Cocktail Club in Dublin, and after tasting our gin, he said, it's like taking a walk in the Connemara countryside. That's what this gin is like. So and recently as well, we were delighted, and full credit to Jimmy, my brother, the head distiller, for his incredibly passionate and tireless work. So the gin actually got a gold medal at the World Gin Awards. Recently for the best contemporary Irish gin, so we were delighted with that. It's a blind tasting competition, so it's really good. Um, so hopefully that answers the botanical sort of influence.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Congratulations on that. It's a great
Okay.
competition. I'm very familiar. And one final follow up: bog bean. I don't suppose it's an actual legume. Is it a root? Is it what exactly is the bean or the bog bean?
Yeah, so the bean part, I'm guessing, is kind of maybe the fruit, not a fruit as such, but this kind of bean which is on the plant late summer after it flowers. So it flowers during May. The rest of the year, it's just this stem. It almost resembles like asparagus or bamboo, but it's a pliable sort of bamboo. It'd be more like asparagus in its texture. So that grows all year round. So we pick that stem, and this stem is submerged in water, and it's only the flowering part which is visible above the surface of the water during the summer. So in Latin, it's called minianthes. So in case anybody wants to look it up, but over your neck of the woods, Eric, they may refer to it colloquially as buckbean. So it's just that we would call it bog bean here because of obviously bog and bogland and where it grows. Oops, have I lost you?
Yes, yes.
No, no.
I have encountered something very similar by the seaside. Here they call it either sea bean or I believe glasswort, and so it's a smaller, probably in the same family, but yes, it very much reminds me of what you're describing. So now that we've hit the poutine, or the Poitín, sorry, and the gin, the Connemara gin. What about the whiskeys that you have launched? Because I am sure that in the distilling landscape right now in Ireland, whiskey is probably one of the more competitive categories. So, what is the Mickel Distillery approach to Irish whiskey?
Our approach, I suppose, to Irish whiskey is the Fuishke approach, and what's Fuishke all about? Firstly, I suppose we have two great distilling traditions here in Galway and Connemara. They're the two traditions. So. You had these legitimate Parliament whiskey distilleries. By the way, the reason I mentioned Parliament is because that's kind of how people differentiated between legal whiskey that was tax paid and licensed versus the illicit whiskey which was made in the mountains. So Connemara had its own whiskey tradition or Fushka tradition. We've kind of delved into that a bit in terms of Poitín. So that is mixed mash bills and smaller casks and peating. So we're one of the few Irish distilleries that are continuing this peating or peat influenced whiskey. So we still cut our own turf, still harvest it, etc. Small quantities, so you don't need large quantities of turf to do the malting or the peating of the malt. In terms of Galway City, then there's this wealth of tradition in Galway of legitimate Parliament distilleries. Some of these distilleries were selling whiskey, throughout the world. This is back in the time in the early 20th century, up to the early 20th century, when Irish whiskey was the global market leader. So Irish, we just paint the broad picture. 60% of global whiskey market share was Irish. Okay, now we only have approximately 5% market share, but thankfully we also have one of the fastest growing spirit categories in the world. So it's great to see such strong growth in the category. So in terms of the Galway City tradition, then, so if you look at some of the place names and you look at some of the history of the port, it's got this tremendous, I suppose, history of trading with Latin Europe. So that is basically France, Portugal, and Spain. So we used to import huge quantities of wines, fortified wines, and spirits. Great news for the local distilleries that they had this steady supply of seasoned casks. Now, the trade, I suppose, in Galway, obviously there was the local trade within the city walls, but however, it's important to note as well that many of these liquids or products were being sold not only in Galway but throughout Connacht and even throughout Ireland. And as well as that, there was a gateway for these products as well to go to the UK into England because it was cheaper from a tax perspective to do so, right? So, for instance, we have two independent bottlings, which I'll briefly describe now in a second and what inspired each of them. But we imported, for instance, more Bordeaux red wine, just so that people can identify with what does he mean by wine and fortified wine. So in terms of red wine, we imported more Bordeaux red wine than any other Irish port towards the late Middle Ages. And we would have been the second biggest importer if you combine Ireland and England together. Huge. You can imagine that's a huge amount of Bordeaux red wine coming in, and it's fascinating as well that not only was there that amount of Bordeaux red wine coming in, and the those other fortified wines such as different types of sherries and ports. We will touch on that influence in a moment. But when you go to Bordeaux, many of the chateaus or a number of the chateaus certainly have Irish surnames and Irish ancestry. So it's amazing the links that exist between Galway and those chateaus and those vineyards. Similarly, then in terms of Spain, for example, huge amount of Spanish genetics here around Galway. So there was quite an interesting documentary done on this subject approximately 6-7 years ago, and literally did genetic testing on people. Obviously, they were part of the documentary, and they were just verifying and checking, I suppose, was there as much Spanish genetics there as was thought, and fascinatingly, there was. So it's incredible, in terms of the mixing of cultures that goes on. So no surprises when people come to Galway, and I hear it all the time. They say Dublin is great. They've been to other parts of Ireland, but then they come to Galway. And look, I'm biased, of course, but just don't rely on me. Rely on what everyone else is saying. But there is a certain friendliness here. There's a certain culture here, a certain openness here, and you can be anybody here. I suppose it doesn't matter whether you're wealthy or poor. You can all actually have, and I think this is a really great barometer of where how open a city or a place is. Can individuals from every kind of segment of society, can they mix in the same place? And the answer to that in Galway is yes. And you'll see people sort of having every kind of conversation there, around Galway city centre. So, yeah, it certainly does feel different. And again, when you, as a local, it's when you leave and go somewhere else that you're reminded of what is different about the place. But in terms of we are laying down whiskey here at the moment, only in small quantities. We're laying down five 50-litre casks per week, and you're probably wondering, why are you filling it into 50-litre casks? Is that traditional? And I suppose to answer that, it is. So, for instance, I'm going to just mention one distillery. We wouldn't have time to mention them all, but one of the famous Galway distilleries was called Burke's Quarter Barrel Distillery. So, for anyone coming to Galway, the modern way of the site is now the Jury's Inn Hotel, but historically that used to be Burke's Quarter Barrel Distillery. It's down at the Spanish Arch. So the reason they were nicknamed quarter barrel distilleries, essentially, they sold, amongst other casks, they sold quarter barrels. And just to remind your listeners, I suppose I don't maybe need to, but just to emphasize it, the trade for whiskey pre sort of 20th century wasn't from in a bottled form. It was in cask form from the distilleries, and of course, those casks would have been bottled locally. Now, again, that shifted as the distilleries became more concerned with building brands and retaining the authenticity of the liquid, etc. So as things became more regulated and tightened up, but back then it was whiskey by the cask. And interestingly as well, the carters from the distillery would take barrels or casks from the distillery to the whiskey warehouses, and they used to get these carters coins, right? And that was the sort of currency that they would exchange at the end of the week, so that they could get paid in pounds at the time. Way before we had the euro and whatnot. Now we've actually recreated those coins, and they are actually have one of them here. So on the, I don't know if this is visible, but that's one side of it, and that's obviously our logo. But if you look at the back of it, and this is like you'd find on the old coin, one of these sort of ships coming into Galway Bay. So it's a bit of I think it's combining the best of the two traditions, our tradition and what was done historically. But anyway, we're laying down in 50-litre casks. Most of the whiskey we're currently producing is actually being put towards our cask ownership offering. So there's 240 of these 50-litre casks in it. And thankfully, the uptake has been very strong since we launched it late last year. And so it's very customizable. People can choose in terms of they can choose a single malt, they can choose a modern form of the single pot still. But we also have there's only a number of these left, but we also have a mash bill, which is a pure pot still. So that's before, of course, the name of single pot still had to be changed from a consumer perspective. The reason it was changed is because people felt the word pure may have been misleading, but that was just the old term for single pot still. So there are the three mash bills, and then there's five different types of casks. You've got your traditional ex-bourbon, Oloroso, sherry, Pedro Jimenez, sherry, port. And one of the things that's permitted in Irish whiskey is the use of woods that aren't oak, which of course isn't permitted in every whiskey making nation. So we do have one cask that fits into that segment, and it's a virgin Spanish chestnut cask. So and again, it's just, I suppose, to offer that diversity there for people. But key thing there, the mash bills, they're all peated, and again, it's our Connemara peat that we're using. So we had started laying down whiskey there in 2020, and before we even contemplated the idea of doing independent bottling, we're all aware of what independent bottling is. It's buying whiskey from an existing distillery and either bottling it right there, right then, or influencing it. And I suppose because we were already a whiskey distillery, and because of, I suppose, our tradition, we really wanted to, whatever we were doing, to influence it as much as possible. So we chose our own finishing casks and finished both whiskies that we created, or finished rather. We chose the casks and sourced the casks from them, and I'll touch on them now in a second. But just conscious you might have questions on any of the aforementioned.
No, I think it's fascinating to hear that your barrel aging program is very much in the same spirit of honoring the place where you're currently operating, the traditions that existed beforehand. I honestly, I'm just engrossed in the storytelling, because a lot of the storytelling that we get around Irish whiskey is very much funneled to us by a handful of big brands that are not necessarily Galway centric. So it's just a little slice of culture that, being here in America, I've just never been exposed to. So it seems like you're doing an interesting thing, at least from the American standpoint, of like actually selling these quarter casks as casks, which is interesting to me. Obviously, you've got some interesting barrel finishes. The virgin Spanish chestnut is pretty cool as well. I'm very interested in non-oak barrels in general. I think if we were to zoom out, and if I had an omniscient view of the overall world distilling cultures, I think a much larger portion than we would otherwise suspect of the overall historical cask finishing percentage would be non-oak, especially if you go back far enough in time. So I would love to see so many more operations today playing around with that. And I think we will, especially with the way that the cooperage market is currently headed. But yeah, finish us off. What is the rest of the Mickel whiskey program look like?
So that's, I suppose, the what do you call it, the cask program. So it's 3 mash bills, 5 different types of casks, and each of those casks, then you're looking at approximately 90 bottles coming out if you bought it 46%. But people can, they can bottle it at cask strength if they wish, and the bottles will be personalised. So really, it's about joining us on this journey. It is the first whiskey in Galway in over 100 years, and it's really limited, the quantity overall that's being laid down. Now, we do have plans for a newer facility in South Connemara, going back to the roots of where we're from. So I'm not at liberty, I suppose, to mention every detail about it, but what people can gauge at this point is that we're certainly going to have a very big presence in terms of the facility and how much we can actually produce. So this new facility will be capable of producing, over 500,000 liters of pure alcohol per year, which is the equivalent of 1.5 million bottles of whiskey per year. And this is really going to breathe life back into this region of Connemara. Going to provide employment for locals. And in terms of the whiskey that we're going to be producing, again, really focused on authenticity in terms of most of this whiskey is going to be peated, and again, we will hang on to the traditions of those casks that would have been traditionally used. But so anyway, just I thought I'd finish that one off. Just in case anyone is interested, they can just reach out via the website if they have any interest in those casks, because really, I suppose, the people we're trying to, I suppose, you know, I suppose, attract to join us would be those that have a genuine interest in whiskey and a genuine interest in something that is very authentic and very different. So, and again, I think people like the lineage and the family story that's there. So, look, it's a really exciting journey. Everyone who has already bought a cask, they're really excited with us. Any case, they can reach out there to us. So. The other piece then is the two independent whiskey bottlings. So Invrin is the Connemara style of whiskey. Like I said, it's independently bottled. Full transparency on that particular bottling is on our website. So we want it to be super transparent in terms of what we're doing. So somebody can just go to our website, download the actual full disclosure of where the whiskey comes from, which casks were used, which percentages, etc. So it's incredibly transparent. And look, to be honest, we've been really commended on it by the whiskey community, thankfully. And so that's a 5-part peated blend. It contains 2 grain whiskies, double distilled single malt, triple distilled peated single malt, and a single pot still. 4 of the 5 components were aged in ex-bourbon, and one of the grain whiskey components was aged in virgin American oak. And then we vatted all those components together. All of them were at least 3 years old, a lot of them 4 years old plus. And then we vatted them together and we put them into our finishing casks. So Pedro Jimenez, of course, because of the Spanish influence here in Galway, wanted to emphasize the fruity notes of the whiskey. And then ex-bourbon, but ex-bourbon with a twist. We resized these ex-bourbon casks to sort of mimic I suppose, again, kind of like those quarter barrels to emphasize more of the wood. So again, obviously, the smaller the cask, the greater the wood influence on the cask. So just wanted to introduce a bit of that tradition in there. And because we didn't have full control over how peated the whiskey was, we wanted to give it a little touch of Connemara turf. So our heritage Poitín spent less than 10 weeks in a virgin Spanish chestnut cask. And then we took that virgin Spanish chestnut cask and put some of the vatted whiskey together in there. And of course, we left them for 9 months. We initially thought the whiskey would be ready at about 6 months old, but 6 months finishing, but it wasn't. So we said, this is going to be right. It's not going to, this isn't going to go to market until it's right. So we left it the extra number of months. And thankfully, by month 9, we were thrilled with the result, in terms of the flavor and the finish and the aroma of the whiskey. So that's the Invrin one, the Connemara one, and again, it's peated. Then we had a very typical, and hopefully this kind of re-emphasizes what the differences are in terms of Connemara Fushka versus Galway City whiskey. So the Galway City whiskey is a very typical pot still, triple distilled, mixed mash bill. So you have half malted barley, half unmalted barley. So an abundance of spice, an abundance of oils, and it's originally aged in ex-bourbon and then finished in 2 different types of casks. I've mentioned already that Bordeaux red wine was a bit of a favorite around here, so we decided to finish it in Bordeaux red wine. But we wanted to give it just a textural kiss, I guess, of peating. So we used a peated quarter cask. So that's a 125 litre cask then to finish it in as well. So it's a 75%, 25% split, Bordeaux to peated quarter cask. And they're 2 incredibly distinct whiskies, so it's great to give people a very different flavor from, relatively speaking, not that big a region, so you have Connemara and then Galway City just on the doorstep. So, and yet they produce these very different styles of whiskey. Now they share similarities, but it's amazing that they're distinct.
Yeah, those are fascinating, I guess, sort of entry points. It's very exciting, of course, that you're getting ready, kind of in the early phases of launching a larger facility. And nonetheless, I think that the processes that you were just describing and the flavor building and storytelling that you're doing is very much consistent. It sort of goes back to your grandfather as that storyteller, right? So I think if there's one way in which the what we might call the official government sanctioned version of your family distilling practice is paying tribute to what came before. It's that you're continuing the legacy of storytelling. That to me is my big takeaway here. So for those who aren't interested, obviously you said go to the website if you're interested in learning more about the independent bottlings or about the cask program. Where in general can people in the great country of Ireland or in the UK or the EU or elsewhere in the world, who has access on the shelf to your products, and maybe are there any plans for entering different markets as we go here?
Yes, so just immediately to satisfy people's thirst, the quickest way I think would be to go to our website. We have a new fully e-commerce website, and just to give full mention and full credit there to Ross here, my business partner, and ably assisted by our whiskey specialist and head of domestic sales, Mark McLaughlin. So there's two very influential people there working on who did this wonderful website build. So people can go and buy directly from the website, and the website will ship. Not that the website does it personally, but we ship throughout Europe, and we also do Northern Ireland. UK is a little bit tricky at the moment, and but we are working on the US. So in terms of markets, we have plans to enter. We're already selling some of our products in the UK. We're already selling our full range in Germany. In a small capacity, but in terms of for instance, I know that perhaps a lot of your listenership would be US based, but we certainly have plans to enter into the US market. So we're still having conversations with different importers, and but one of the key things that will be happening is the recruitment of as someone looking after the international markets for us. So. Basically, when all those things slot into place, we will hopefully be on your shores fairly quickly. Now, if people want to buy in the meantime, they can go to irishmalts.com or .ie, and they can pick up our products there, and they do ship to the US. But we do, of course, want to have proper physical presence on shelves, whether it's bar shelves or off license or liquor store shelves, I should say. And again, we'll probably take it state by state and city by city, as opposed to don't expect us to be nationwide in year one. But I think with e-commerce and the way it's opening up as well, that may be a strong possibility for people to get access, over a short period of time.
I think you're absolutely right. And if you're looking for places in the U.S. with surprisingly lax, or we'll call friendly, inviting liquor laws, here where I am in Washington, D.C. is often referred to as the Wild West. So pretty much anything goes here. So if you're looking for a big city on the East Coast with a very enthusiastic set of bartenders who are excited to get their hands on great new products, then maybe we'll find our paths crossing here in the not too distant future. So
I better make a note of it. And is it true that was it George Washington who had his own distillery as well, and
yes, indeed.
a very influential character in very early liquor laws?
Yes, yes, and the irony is that he was forced to put down a rebellion of unhappy distillers very early on in his presidency. So there's a little bit of irony there because yes, right across the river from D.C., he does have his legacy distilling operation there. So Pádraic, thank you so much for taking the time with me. Do you have time for one or two quick lightning round questions?
Go ahead. I
All right.
do.
So we've been talking straight spirits here for almost the entire time. What's your favorite cocktail? And if you don't have a favorite of all time, what's maybe a cocktail that you've been getting into recently?
I'm a big fan of old fashions, and failing an old fashioned, depending on the occasion, I would probably go for a sour.
Ah, beautiful. Sour. What is your acid there? The sour is a very large category. You've got your margaritas,
Yeah,
you've got your
so
whiskey sours. Are you a
I,
lemon, a lime?
yeah, I would, to be honest, I'd go for poitín sour, and I would use lemon juice, egg white, sugar syrup, of course, the obligatory dry shake, followed by the shake with ice and double strain it. And you could use some like maybe peach or apricot bitters, just for just on the top. So I wouldn't use Angostura necessarily with the poitín sour.
Oh, the man knows what he wants. You led with just sort of a sour, and then we ended up with a work of art here. I like it. And then, do you have any controversial views or beliefs in the spirits world?
Do I have controversial views? I'm sure I do. Um, I really think that anybody who's involved in the industry that they should have to be transparent and authentic. So any loopholes I think that permit people to use kind of smoke and mirrors, and maybe that's not controversial at all, but I think that people should have to be transparent, in the interest of the consumer.
Well, if we can find counterexamples, I suppose it's controversial, at least to some out there. So, Pádraic, I really appreciate the time you've taken here with me. I've gotten a really good sense of you and your ethos and the flavors that you are working so hard to preserve and to share with a lot of people. I learned a lot today, not only about Fuishka and Poitín in general, but about the Connemara and the Galway spirits in particular. So thank you for sharing that. And really quickly before we head out, what are the best ways for our listeners to engage with you on social media?
So our handle is at Mickel Distillery. We're on Instagram, Facebook. We're on Twitter as well, but we're kind of more active, I guess, on the likes of Instagram or Facebook. And in a professional sense, if anybody wants to link up with us, we're also on LinkedIn. They'll find us at Mickel Distillery. Hopefully, I don't know. Do you have any other questions left there, Eric?
I don't. I think we'll wrap it up here, so that I can let you wrap up your day. I know that you're several hours ahead of us here, but Pádraic, I just wanted to thank you once again for being a guest here on the Modern Bar Cart podcast.